We're going to focus on the role that government can take in order to stimulate or contract the economy. In this case, you're seeing a recessionary gap. Potential GDP is higher than actual GDP, and therefore our recessionary gap is this vertical distance, and the GDP shortfall is this horizontal distance. So obviously we want to stimulate the economy because we're worried about a recession. Government can stimulate the economy in two ways. Number one, the government can increase spending directly into the economy, either by borrowing or using some maybe surpluses from previous years. Okay, so that's one way the government can stimulate the economy. Another one is the government can cut taxes. They can decide to cut taxes, like especially income taxes, and what that will do is it will raise the disposable income for people and therefore raise consumption. Okay, so consumption will increase. Will shift up in this case because it's basically an artificial increase in the amount of money that they have through taxes, cuts in taxes. If we had an inflationary gap, the opposite situation, obviously we would want to contract the economy. The government would be worried about inflation, and therefore the government can either decrease spending, or which will lower G, or increase taxes, which will lower C. Either of these policies, basically, whatever they choose to do, that's called fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is actions taken by the government to contract or stimulate our economy, okay, as opposed to monetary policy, which is something that's used by the Federal Reserve Bank, which we'll look at that later. But let's look at a situation where the government will want to stimulate the economy. So, and let's say the government decides to spend in order to stimulate the economy. So government spending will increase. The question is, how much do we want government spending to increase by? Well, if we have a $1 trillion GDP gap, let's assume that our marginal propensity to consume is 0.75. Okay, if our marginal propensity to consume is 0.75, our multiplier is equal to 4. Okay. Now, we want our GDP to grow by 1 trillion. So with a multiplier of 4, that means that government should spend basically 1/4 of a trillion. Because if the initial increase in government spending is 1/4 of a trillion, the multiplier will do the rest. Right? You take 1/4 of a trillion, you multiply it by 4, because that's the multiplier effect, and you get a $1 trillion increase in our GDP, in output, right, or in income in the economy. Okay, so government spending will increase by $250 billion, right? It's also 1 trillion divided by 4, which is equal to 0.25 trillion, which is 250 billion. Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. Now let's say that the government, instead of increasing spending directly into the economy, they decide, you know what, we don't want to spend money directly into the economy. What we want to do is we want to decrease taxes so that we stimulate consumption. Now, if you think about it, decreasing taxes will, again, lead to an increase in disposable income. But the issue here is that while it will increase people's disposable income and consumption will go up, savings will also increase. Because people not only consume their income, they also save their income. How much will their consumption and saving increase from that additional disposable income will depend on the marginal propensity to consume. So let's look at this for a second. Let's take the same example, $1 trillion difference between actual and potential GDP. The multiplier is still 4 because the MPC is still 0.75. Okay, and the government decides to cut taxes. By how much? Well, to answer that question, what we need to do is we need to realize, all right, we want consumption to go up by 250 billion. How do I know that? Well, because I know that at the end of the day, I want my GDP to grow by $1 trillion. I know that my multiplier is 4, and so I know that I want my initial increase in aggregate expenditure. I want this shift, okay, to be basically worth $250 billion. Just like this shift was worth $200 billion when I increased government spending earlier. In this case, the increase is going to come from consumption, not from government spending, because we're cutting people's taxes and they have more disposable income. All right. So, let me just fix that real quick. Okay. So, if you realize that when people get more income because their taxes are reduced, they consume more, but they also save more, you realize that they only consume a portion of the increase in disposable income that they got. And so if we want consumption to go up by $250 billion, we really want the tax cut to be greater than $250 billion, because the MPC tells us that 75% of the increase in disposable income will be consumed. Not all of it, right? Not 100% will be consumed, but only 75% will be consumed. And 25% of it will be saved. And therefore, in order to compute the amount that we need to cut taxes by, we need to take X. That's the amount that we will eventually want to cut taxes by. We're going to multiply that by 0.75, right? And that should equal 250 billion, which is the amount that we want consumption to go up by. X obviously will be a greater number. Turns out that X, is about 333.333, right, billion dollars. And if the government gives this tax cut to people, okay, then people will consume, they will increase consumption by $250 billion, all in all in our economy, and will increase their savings by the difference between the two. Okay, so $83.3333 billion. Okay, that will lead to our consumption increasing by that amount. And eventually, since our consumption increased by 250 billion, our GDP will increase by 1 trillion because of our multiplier, which is 4. Okay. Now look, if the situation was reversed, if we had an inflationary gap, right, when actual GDP is higher than potential, the inflationary gap is this vertical distance. The GDP gap is 1 trillion. The same logic follows, it's just in reverse, right? And so the government will, lower government spending by 250 billion, and if they want to contract the economy through taxes, they would increase taxes by $333.3333 billion. That way people will consume less. They will also save less, but they will consume less, and that is basically, that will lead us back to our equilibrium over here, because after all, visually, we're going to have this occur. Okay.